queries and questions. Can kindly introduce yourself and then ask?
I'm Yogesh Sharma, former advisor for Namami Gange, and before that I was the director in NRCD Ministry of Environment. I have been involved with this sector for a very long time, like most of my life. So I'm very curious because your presentation was very nice, but somehow or the other I'm quite confused because it's quite different from our system. What I wanted to know is, the city councils have no role in planning for sewerage. In India, urban development is the key to decide on things. But there is a lot of unchecked urban development also going on, in which case then political solutions are found and eventually schemes are made to retrofit those kind of habitation, which is of course very messy business. Here the government is involved to retrofit. But in Malaysia, you say it is the private sector which takes the lead. Now, how does the private sector find it viable to actually fund the sewerage sector and then be able to recover its money, because they must be taking finance from a bank or some financial institution. So even if the government is putting in a bit of support for the viability gap funding, how is it that the private sector is able to actually recover its money when the private sector is not able to recover its money in the sewerage sector anywhere in the world? Not only in India, everywhere the government eventually has to step in and support the local services, what is known as the council in your country or what is known as municipal services here. I think the recent example everybody will remember was of Detroit going bust and Chicago going bust. So the local councils, the tertiary government in most countries are actually the weakest. So how is it that in Malaysia the private sector is actually so vibrant that it is able to finance the sewerage sector and still continue, and the government really doesn't have to step in except that the regulator is able to do this thing? That part I am not very clear. Can you please try to amplify? Maybe my understanding is not much about Malaysia.
We can take 2-3 questions and then you can respond.
Mine is linked to yours.
Okay.
Very linked. So this is what, thank you so much, because this is what we were looking for. I'm Urvashi, I'm the wash advisor and the director of a small company called Practical Action Consulting India Private Limited, which has made, in my view, and I will invite you along with CPR, which is here, a state-of-the-art FSTP in Helkanan, a small municipality in Odisha. I'm just back from the field, so I have a lot of inputs on this. And by the way, I want to thank Malaysia government for this, because the model we have now grounded, including it's reached the stage of composting from fecal sludge, which is in the market, is from Malaysia. So Anjuji from CPR is our partner on that. So my questions are from the ground. I will link it to Yogeshji's question. One is from, you get her name, Punita. The other factor I wanted to ask, that practical action works for the poorest, the least, and the last. So generally the private sector participation and their interest in any sewerage or any system is for profits. So how do you deal with these slums, these small pockets where even the sewerage is not able to reach, of course it's not able to reach, but even the desludging services are not able to reach. So my question is linked to Yogeshji's question. But then that is one question. The linked question is, you talk about the social aspect of dealing with this. And the other question very specifically is your model about sewerage versus fecal sludge treatment plants. And what the hypothesis you made was that maybe sewerage is more cost effective. And in my view, whatever we're implementing in Henkel on this model, the desludging, scheduled desludging itself and the fecal sludge treatment plant, which is by the way gravity based, it's not based on electricity, is much more cost effective maybe than the so-called centralized systems which are being experimented in the country. So these two questions.
Yeah, please.
Can you talk about how the desludging is done? Because that's a whole human issue here. I mean, is it mechanized? How is it done? Is it done by people? Is it, all that?
One question here, then we can take, Sunita, you can respond to these four questions. One, just next to me.
My name is Raghava from the World Bank. I work with Water Global Practice. Thanks a lot for this presentation. So as you said, information is very key. Data, you mentioned about data requirement. Information is key for regulation, right? So who collect the data, whether it is a local body or other ministries, etc. That is one issue. Second one is communication with the public is also another important factor to get their ownership. How do you do that?
Yes, okay. So I'll go on the first question first on private sector financing. Private sector financing comes for capital works, not for services. Services is actually from tariff and government subsidy. This is where the services funds comes in. For capital works, when private sector actually finance, in Malaysia, the way infrastructure is being developed is interlinked. There are some other slides which is not, I didn't put in this particular deck. It's leveraging on policies of other sector. In Malaysia, the way they have leveraged on is housing policy. When come to housing policy, I think I'll answer together on the poor aspect of it. Government actually put up certain requirement. When any developers, real estate developers put up houses or subdivide the land to put houses. I do not know whether the method will be the same as in India. So I'm talking about Malaysian method there. When they subdivide and change the land conversion, land use, as well as once they change land use to building and put up building, they have to get approval from not just local authority but many other agencies. And this regulator is one of the agencies. They must get approval before they get a development order. They can go to the bank to secure funds. So all these agencies, including land, water and sewerage, roads, energy, telecommunication, all these external technical agencies, input must be taken into consideration, and the developer need to cost it into his development. So once he cost it in, only then he can actually get development order for them to secure loans from the bank. Because without development order, no banks will give them loans. And how they recover is through the sales of the property. Because all the cost has been built into the property prices. So that's how it is being recovered. So they actually recover almost immediately the moment they sell off the property. Okay, that's one part. Linking it to your question on poor, because government also requires certain development of certain size, a percentage of it must be constructed for poor. They call it low-cost housing. So this particular low-cost housing must be constructed at cost and handed over to the state. For state will actually do a balloting to the poor. Sorry. So in that case, there is no differentiation on the infrastructure or the services poor receives. It is the same. Because there is no, when come to evaluation by these agencies, when come to electricity, telecommunication, water and sewerage, it is not based on the affordability. The technical component of it remains the same for all. But the tariff that actually gets imposed on them is actually based on what is the classification. If it's low-cost housing, for sewerage it's only 2 ringgit a month, which is 20 cents more than the posting cost. So this is how the costing works. So the recovery is through the property prices. Next is the question on fecal sludge versus connected services. I am talking from Malaysia angle, so Dan Canal have to see how Dan Canal experience is, and I think Dan Canal treatment plan, I was just talking to Anju and Ambrish. It's so huge, I think can fit into football field, 3 football fields. Yes, that is, if someone finds that piece of land in Malaysia, they will use every lobby group to buy that land to put up a condominium. So that's what will happen. So the thing is, when I make this analogy of fecal sludge going to be more expensive, there are 2 ways of calculating the cost. One way is actually capital and operation cost. Another one is regulatory and environmental cost. Actually, in this, there's one particular slide. I mean, if you like it, you can look at it and ask me more questions when you have the time, because we are short of time. The two component is environmental cost and regulatory costs that normally will not take into consideration. Imagine what is the cost of regulating 10,000 treatment plants compared to 2 million septic tanks. Because ensuring that the septic tank is actually dislodged, septic tank is properly sized, functioning, the permit holders who are running around are actually taking from the plant, taking from the household to the property, so there is a cost to it. So analysis must be done. When it comes to this particular dynamics that I put, this is something that I call SISCA, Sewerage Infrastructure Selection Criteria. It is actually dynamic to that particular area. So what is that area? What is the most suitable technology for that area? That, yeah, it's just that even Malaysia, even though they approve it, but they haven't rolled it out. So it needs to be developed further. But it's dynamic to the respective area. It's no one rule fit all. The biggest flaw, I mean, it's also a good thing at that point of time, but the biggest flaw I would say is after 26, almost 30 years, Malaysia held onto one way of doing things. 150 population equivalent and above must put up a treatment plant. So that is one way of doing things. Another thing is when I'm talking about tariff. When you want to price a tariff, you want to cost least resistance. You do not want people to be unhappy paying that tariff. So you wouldn't want to differentiate the tariff so much. This is something that I had in mind. I'm not saying it's going to work, but as one of the lessons I mentioned, better do something than doing nothing at all. Right now, people are not dislodging. The reason is the dislodging regulation and dislodging rules has not been firmed up, and there's a lot of dispute. Operator is making a lot of higher revenue, dislodging small group of people. Once this regulation comes on board, they will make reasonable revenue, but dislodging high group of people. So that's why there is a challenge there to create a balance. So that's why remove that whatever barriers that is possible from people. And then we can sort out government, can sort out politician, can sort out operators. So this is the angle I came from. Dislodging method. In Malaysia, there's only one way of dislodging. Everything is vacuum dislodging. They use vacuum tankers to do the dislodging. Vacuum tankers. Is highly regulated, not only by SPAN. There's another agency called SPAT, or now they call APAT, on the vehicle, because it's a vacuum vehicle, and also I think by Department of Safety and Health. So any kind of pressurized vehicles being used, Department of Safety and Health also will come into picture. Data collection and communication. Data collection is actually, before SPAN came on board, operators are already collecting the data. Once SPAN came on board, SPAN actually imposed more data requirement. Some of the data is actually transmitted either real time, daily basis or weekly basis to a system in SPAN. They call the system VBs. So all this data get actually migrated. So what kind of data is required is something that regulator will look at the business plan they're submitting, the KPIs that are being imposed. So that means that they want to get the data. The approach that at that point of time what I've taken is, you want to collect the data as frequently as possible to see end of the period whether they're performing or not. Not collecting the data end of the period to say whether they're performing or not. So because a lot of time when we collect data at the, like for example, it's a 3-year appointment, so annually we are collecting it. The data can be improvised. So you want to reduce the improvisation of the information, regular collection of data is essential. Communication. Communication is generally, I do not know whether I'm answering a question on that, is generally through website, social media. Is that what you are requesting?
Community part, social.
Okay, social, there's two components here. One is public consultation for regulatory framework, amendment to the law, those kind of component. That is normally targeted stakeholders. So they will have workshops, close engagement. But really, this is depending on the officer in charge. Because it is mandated in the law, but it is a may, it's not a should. So when you come to may, some people may follow, some people may not follow, right? So it's really depending on the officer who handling that. Some will go extensive consultation and take time. One thing about consultation is it's going to take time. Okay, but the likelihood is you'll get a document that is well accepted and very thorough. But there is also, if the KPI is set, is within 3 months you have to come up with something, is how much consultation can you do, right? So that's another approach. But that is on the consultation part. When it comes to awareness and campaign, there is a reliance on water forum. As I mentioned, water forum is given certain budget. These are consumer people, these are activists who actually work closely with the community, with schools, villages and all those things. So budget is actually given to them, so they will do a lot of such work. But when it comes to enforcement, if you actually go to SPAN Facebook site, they tend to share enforcement activity. For example, water theft is a criminal offense. So if someone steals the water operator complains to the regulator will go to the site to do raiding. So all those things get published. That's actually a form of creating awareness. So this is various mechanisms they use. Not the best, not sufficient. I wouldn't say it's sufficient, but I guess the last 1-2 years, they have increased such share of information.
But you don't have a regulation that mandatory that before a sewage system is put up. Like in India, we have in certain cases that you have to have a community public meeting as per the Right to Information Act, where if certain services being provided by the government or private, the communities or groups which are affected by it or are involved in it, their approval in writing or otherwise has to be there, otherwise at least it cannot be set up. That's what I'm saying. You are saying that there's a regulation.
Okay.
But is there an enforcement?
They call it social impact assessment, right? Okay, there is, but it's not that many. As you see, most of the just not the budget component, government actually provide very small budget. This is the budget where existing treatment plants get connected and larger regional plants get constructed. These happen in an area where it's already populated. So social impact assessment is needed. When developer actually construct, there's nothing there, it's a green field. No, most of the private sector, because most of the funding comes from private sector, most of the facilities put up by private sector. They actually construct in a green field. They don't construct in a populated area. It's the green land they're putting up. So the need for social impact assessment or such requirement is not put in place. But for government projects, yes. They will actually do the social impact assessment, community participation. But I don't think it's a specific rule for it. I think it's a part of development requirement. And I don't think their approval is actually necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. Take the mic, Isha. Let the mic come to you. You will not record it.
Cannot be recorded, is it?
Hi, when you say that we should have less of regulations, so when you say that we should have less of regulations, that's what Malaysia is being told you. What do you mean by that? What genre of regulations are you asking should be less? What are the regulations that you have already in Malaysia that you think tightening of them every now and then is actually leading to a adverse impact? That's another question.
Okay, there was another case study that I put up, but later I removed because I did anticipate the time will be short. One regulation we had in Malaysia is sewerage works approval or planning, design and construction rules. This particular regulation or the method of approval has been going on since 1990s. No one question it. Everyone adopt that thing, and every time there's an issue and come to planning, design and construction, more requirement has been put into this guideline, which later became regulation in 2013. Then ease of doing business came on board. That actually caused regulators to think deeper. What is the purpose? So when we actually analyze that particular, if I want to simplify that, when I actually analyze the regulation, I find that the entire objective of that regulation is to improve quality of sewage infrastructure. And when we actually analyze it, none of it actually delivers this output. It's very procedural, has no influence or impact on the quality. So that's where regulatory impact assessment comes on board.
You also mentioned that there are three number of legal instruments that we should take care of instead of regulations. Contracts, licenses and statutes. To my understanding as a legal person, there is a lot of overlapping between these three legal instruments and the regulations that you normally have on board for any genre of services to be provided. For example, if you have desludging being done by private operators, these private operators, as again mentioned in one of the slides, are given a license by SPAN. I guess that's the authority out here. So license is a part of the regulatory framework. And if we have so much of private regulators flying around in the country, we do need a regulatory authority to manage or to ensure that they are doing work and not just working for the profit benefit, doing a social welfare work. That's what Sewerage is all about. So how do you balance that out there in Malaysia so that we can also implement a similar thing in India? Because right now, as Sir was pointing out, it's majorly the municipalities who are working, the local government, local bodies. But if you want the private players to come into picture and we want less regulations, how do we do it?
I'm not saying that you. Okay, it's not that you must have less regulation, but the regulation that you have must be meaningful, must bring the value. Otherwise, remove the regulation. If it's the kind of regulation that is that, see, a lot of time, not just regulatory body that I came from, but also other regulators, we have regulation, we have regulation. One of my former officers used a good quote, hiding behind the brown book, because in Malaysia the acts and the regulation is published in a brown book. So he said, hiding behind the brown book. What you have, I have a regulation. Have you ever implemented one case out of that? Did you take action on anybody? So a lot of time what will happen is regulation tend to be very input based. Someone need to have a license, but whether he behaving in accordance to the license, nobody cares. That means the regulation is not effective. So this is what I'm trying to say. And a lot of times such regulation tend to build up. Someone, out of 500 players, one person may do something that is not right. An additional clause will be put in place. Rather than taking action on that one person, it's like typical Pareto analysis. 80% of the time, people actually follow the law. 20% does not. But the laws are actually designed, sorry, I know you're a lawyer, but lawyers tend to go and paint the 80% out of the 20% of the people who do not follow, rather than taking action on the 20%. So this is what I have seen from my own experience. You see, I'm one of those who really fight when it comes to planning, design, and construction rules, because I really thought there's a value to it. I remember fighting it out with the Malaysian Productivity Corporation, because I thought these people do not understand the sector, and I know better, and this is right, because I've been doing it for 20 years anyway. So it cannot be wrong. But when you actually remove that kind of prejudices, we step into regulatory impact assessment, we realize and have to admit, I realize and I have to admit, it didn't bring the value that I expected. 25 procedures that we put in actually translated to 96 procedures behind the scene. And eventually we reduce it to 2 procedures. Each manpower that is allocated to do the job, we can say 450 people were allocated to do the job. For each one of them, 14 days, working days, can be freed up. So this is what we find when we actually change the way the regulation. The rules are still there, but far more simplified and output based. So this is something that I'm trying to get at. So designing regulation is actually becomes a bit more complex, but it has a value. You can see some change. It's not like just shouldn't go on procedures. I'm not saying India has too many regulations, but I can see a lot of complexity that is taking place. You know, like for example, I heard UK has this KPI imposed on one of their agency to remove 400 regulations a year. So I wonder how many thousands they have, right? And some of it has never been used at all.
So any more questions? 2 more. Also just to catch time. We are Rahul and followed by you. Any more? Which is the last round. Yeah, Rahul, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Excellent presentation. One question, but before that, I just want to really congratulate you on your comment on this costs. See, this is something that we have never talked really about. The direct, indirect cost, regulatory cost, environmental cost, and the comment that you made, we should rely on facts and not really on opinions. And the opinion in the sector is generally that FSM is cheaper without really having any numbers. We don't really have the numbers. We are not talking about real costs. And this is really a good eye-opener for discussion, right? So what are we really talking about when we are saying that is cheaper or this is cheaper? And do we really have facts? So I really congratulate you for making it very, very straight. And my question was, like, when we are talking about this privatization in Malaysia in the sewerage sector, so the two first terms that come to my mind is one is India Water Consortium and the other, there is PAN. So what my question is, when we are talking about privatization or liberalization, so how is the private sector competition? Is there enough competition in the market? So India Water Consortium is a big name, but there is, because for the market, if you want to really benefit, so the competition is the first thing. So how is it really in Malaysia? Do you have enough competition and how it is really well maintained?
So,
less but more meaningful regulation. And so I wanted to know your views on risk-based regulation, which I know Southeast Asia uses very, very effectively. I'm wondering if it's been tried in Malaysia at all. I had a second question related to what Raghava had asked before, and this was on data collection. You seem to imply that you rely on private sector for a lot of the data. Is that through data reporting? What are the checks that are sort of applied to the data? Because in India, there is an overwhelming inclination to think that all private sector data is unreliable and only government data holds any credibility. Whereas my personal opinion is that an operator has much greater stake in collecting the data that is relevant because his skin is in the game, right?
Last question.
Hi, Punita. Thanks for a great presentation. So this is something that you talked about in your presentation, although I would have liked to hear much more about this. But just how these septic tanks that were there earlier or are prevalent even now are fairly non-standard, and sometimes these desludging operators have trouble finding them as well. So how did, as regulators, you come in and changed that situation to what it is now, where I suppose you have a lot more prefabricated system? What was the push that led to more effective regulation with respect to that? Was it just that desludging was being regulated, and so as an approach to that, you sort of like went further upstream and tried to fix the on-site sanitation systems, or was it based on purely environmental concerns and mainstreaming of those concerns?
okay, the first one is on the SPAN is the regulator, so they're not in competition with the operators. When come to India Water is actually a monopoly business. Depending on the thing is, if there is a regulator in the country, the best is regulator actually establishes what is the best model, how many operators can actually make it sustain. Creating, I'm not a big fan of monopoly, but I'm a very practical person. Okay, yeah, I'm a very practical person. I mean, of course, we will tend to think everything competitive is good, but I have just shared with you how the competitive doesn't work when come to this particular sector. But that doesn't mean the whole country or whole state or whole district need to have one operator. But it must be designed such a way that anyone who step into this business must be able to sustain. The only way why IWK is sustaining right now is because it's a private company fully owned by Ministry of Finance. And Ministry of Finance is subsidizing these operations. I'm also working with one particular state where it is a state-owned company. They are forced to charge tariff as per IWK's tariff, but they do not get the subsidy. So literally, government have designed anyone else to fail by having such approach. And we also know different areas have different dynamics that will make the tariff differs. For example, in some area, the population density might be so great. The sewers and the tankers may not need to move very far. In some areas, different. So all this dynamics is essential for the regulator to make the necessary decisions. And then say that more than this is not the right number, because you cannot allow one person to operate in detriment to the other. Profits are regulated though. No one is allowed to have more than 10% profit. So it's not something that, it is for someone who's patient for long-term gains, not for short-term and high spikes of rate.
10% ban for every kind of operator.
No, 10%, double digit is the max time. So they are actually, when the business plan is reviewed, they are actually compensated based on their efficiency. Because previously was cost plus model. Cost plus model means the more cost they incur, the tariff will be. So that was not found very effective. So now it's different. They have regulated water accounting. The submission of their business plan must be based on regulated water accounting line item framework. Cost will be qualified, whether that particular cost qualified for tariff or not qualified for tariff. If something like having a political campaign or paying for a football club or something like that, all will be considered as non-qualifying costs. So they do not deserve tariff on that. And then what are the efficiency that they have put in place? So the efficiency gains will be rewarded in terms of tariff. So that's how the evaluation of component works. The second part is risk-based regulation. Actually, when I was talking about planning, design, and construction rules, that was actually based on risk-based regulation. I think that was one component that really got interest of Economic Research Institute and few other agencies, because that is purely risk-based. What are the risks involved and what is going to be regulated and the method going to be regulated. When it comes to data, data is depending on who is actually generating that, doing that particular function. When it comes to planning, design, construction approvals, it is done by the regulator. So actually before I left, actually established this particular component called centralized sewerage database system. That means people actually lock in directly into the database to feed in the information that required for approval. So the data gathering starts from the beginning. But some information is actually operator specific. For example, how the performance of the treatment plant, what is the downtime, how many complaints. So that is actually operator specific. So depending on who actually has the obligation on that function will feed in into the system. The only thing is the check and balance. What I know, you are right. Not right in a sense that private sector may not tell the truth. I think private sector tells the necessary truth because they are private sector. They have to make business, right? So the question is how regulator prepares themselves for these kind of scenarios. Like, not to say government is honest all the time. We have seen that from our experience. That's the reason that we actually went on collecting raw data at the frequency that they collect. For example, it's a real-time data collected real-time. It's a daily or weekly or monthly, it's collected in that fashion. Means this information will be used to calculate the output. So the chances of them manipulating this, because they cannot anticipate what number are they going to put today to have an impact 3 months from now. They can't make the decision today, right? So they will have to give you the real-time data. So this is a mechanism put in place. But of course, the other common initiative is audits. There's audits on the licenses, that's pretty frequent. Standard and non-standard septic tanks. Someone was asking about standard and non-standard septic tanks. Okay, the standardization effort started way back in 1990s. I think even earlier, there was Malaysian Standard 1228. They call it, is already repealed in 1980s. Ministry of Health came up with a septic tank design, which is cast on site. But in 1990s onwards, the migration towards cities are very high. So the prefabricated septic tanks came on board, and prefabricated septic tanks was regulated by the government. Who are the suppliers, what are the design? And prefabricated septic tanks are really cheap. So there's no need for people to actually construct, because it's so cheap that people will just buy and it's plug and play. It's very easy. But there are still POFLASH that is inherited way long time back. So one of the component when I put up the draft dislodging framework is the charges for non-standard septic tank is higher to actually get them to convert to standard septic tank. So that is something that we put in place. Because the regulator has some budget that they can use to even give them rebate and incentives. I mentioned about sewerage capital contribution. I mean, it was in the slide. I didn't talk about it much. Any person who connects to a public system have to pay 1% of the property value to that particular fund. So right now the fund stands at 2 billion Malaysian ringgit. So that fund can be used for such initiatives of providing rebates and incentives. And that need to be separate accounts. It's not the regulator's operation account, and that particular account need to be tabled to the parliament. So there's some form of independence and governance structure there. I hope I answered.
Do you have some regulation on views of the
Can we take some questions during the change because we have to catch the flight also, she has to go to Malaysia. So thank you very much for your participation, also to the Canadian. Okay. So thanks for your participation and very insightful. Thanks for giving us time for this interesting discussion. Please serve outside. We can catch Punita for some more queries and questions that you may have.
You share the presentation?
Yeah, so it will be on put on our website and it will be quickly shared. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.